Another key piece, and I'm going to go over their slideshow. One of the key components in there is universality. Anybody is welcome to apply for a job. You don't have to know somebody or something like that, and you have a year, that you work as a contract worker. In Spain, they have a whole category of contract workers. And you have a year you work as a contract worker. If at the end of that year, you are invited to join, you then have the opportunity to join. And if you want to join, you'll pay $15,000 to get in, but you pay that from your pay. It's not like, oh, you don't have $15,000, you can't come in. It's like, no, they figure out what payment plan you can do, and from your wages, you pay it. If they don't invite you in, though, then you're done as a worker. They don't have a category, past that, where you can work there and not be a member of the workers' cooperative. And so, how did they get there? This was a key piece for me too. Okay, so yeah, when I was trying to figure this out, I hadn't even gotten just how major the history was. I hadn't had that tour. I wish I had the tour before we had the class. I would have understood more, because the historian just gave me all kinds of pieces. But I was already getting that Catholicism had a lot to do with it, And there's this economist, I think he was an economist. He's an American, he's an academic. He's been there for 25 years writing a book. He's in his 70s. And he was like, I haven't finished it, it's just so complex. So he's still working on the book. And I was standing next to him while we were getting a lecture about the school system and all that. And I said, I think Catholicism's got tons to do with this. I was raised Catholic. And definitely not anymore. But he said, I do too. And the interesting thing is, Spain is post-religious. Less than 5% of the young people go to church. And I said, so what does that mean? He said, I don't think it matters. They have the values. They got the values. They got those values partly because of the religion. And while I was there, I was just trying to research and just try and get some grasp as to what's the key to this? And there was this article in America, which is a Jesuit magazine for the United States. And there was an article about why are Catholics so good at cooperatives? And which I didn't know they were, but okay, I believe it, There was this man who was touring, trying to research this, and he was giving a talk in Australia. And he was talking about how he still couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure out what was that key piece. At the end of the talk, a former member of parliament walked up to him and gave him a card, and it had his name on it, and on the back there was one word, fulfillment. And he went home and he looked up fulfillment, and it's a principle of Catholicism. And the principle is that you don't just believe your religion, you live your religion. And that, this guy thought was the key piece. And I think that is the key piece that Father Arizmendi got to all of those workers, all of those teachers, all of those, different groups. That was what he did. He really pretty quickly pulled out of the hands-on stuff, like he did the bank thing and all that. But he was always just looking forward to the next big thing to do. He was never a micromanager. But he didn't have to be because he trained people so well. And the description of what those early managers were and the early people in totally fit who I ran into. I mean, the people that gave us the talks, they were just all so incredibly organized. And like I said, just would pour out the information really, really fast in this really, detailed way that was incredibly organized. Every one of it, it's just one of the pictures I wanted to show was of the breakfast, the Continental Breakfast, a real Continental Breakfast, which is just this board that's half the size of this table, just loaded with foods. And really fascinating to me was the first thing you come to is 4 different kinds of wine for breakfast, Different relationship to alcohol, including sparkling wine, But I was just amazed at the array of foods that were available and the quality of them. They were really good. Everything was really good, right? And the whole thing was maintained by one person who was incredibly friendly, right? And attentive to everything we needed. And, didn't I can't pay, I got to work and stuff. She would stop and relate, but she would end it as quickly as she could, right? After having connected and get back to work, And likewise, our lunch was this, once again, they give you these lunches and serve wine And the coffee is this little tiny espresso. It is really hard to stay awake after lunch, especially with jet lag, But the lunch too, it was like one waitress, and when the Koreans were there, this pretty big dining room was like packed, and she just took care of all of it. Now it was all organized. I mean, she walked out. There was a list of what the entrees were. There was a list of what the appetizer was. There was a list of the desserts, and she came through. She got everything written down really fast, and she would just give. She'd walk out with everybody that wanted one of those that entree. She would give them all to the same one person. Like if it was let's say octopus or something, right? Everybody that wanted octopus in the whole room got it at the same time. And so that's but yeah.
So Pat, you used the word fulfillment. Did you come away from the Mondragon experience with any sense of shared core values?
Oh, completely. Solidarity is the number one shared value. They completely get that. And the subservience of capital. And the the need for capital to serve the community. Yeah, they very much have, and a complete valuation of being industrious, doing the work it takes to, and actually also like following the rules. Literally, there was this point in the 70s where the managerial class was losing touch with the workers, and there was some dissatisfaction, and it went towards a strike. And they organized, and they went to the managers and said, we're going to strike. And they said, you're out if you strike. Read the rules. If you strike, you're no longer a member. You can't do that. You have to go through the system, right? And they struck, and they weren't big enough, and they didn't have it, the critical mass. And the membership voted, not overwhelmingly, about 40% wanted to let the strikers stay, even though, but some 60% was like, nope, you're gone. You didn't follow the rules, you're gone. But if you've got 40% that want them back in, it was an ongoing issue. And so every year they have an assembly where they all come together and they pick the managerial class is not like imposed on them. They pick them, but they pick them for their skill set, And so for the next 3 years or so, they kept trying to get them back in. And finally, the managers, right, they said, we need to bring them back in because this is obviously causing, a division. And they critiqued themselves. They said, we should not have gone there. We should not have told them, you're gone if you do that. We should have instead engaged them and figured out what to do. And indeed, further in this, I talk about how it's very, very hard to get fired there. If you're messing up, you are engaged. They said, we need to work someplace else. What's the problem? You have to really be determined to get fired. They're not into firing. They're into engagement. So does that answer? I mean, there's other values too, but so much of that I think is cultural too. It's not like we all are going to immediately be incredibly disciplined and industrious, and also going to say we've agreed on rules and follow them. I mean, I worked in a collective restaurant. Our meetings were like an Edward Albee play. Does everybody know what I mean? Does everybody know about Edward Albee? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? That play. I mean, some of the lines I heard, literally this one woman saying to this gay man, "That's because you're weak. You've always been weak." It's like, wait, what? What am I hearing? And I left this total successful business place called Just Desserts, where I worked my butt off all night long. I ran through this huge former freeze-dried chive factory. I would have to shout from close to a football field away where I was mixing dough when the oven went off saying, I got it, and I would run to go get the oven because you always did the oven yourself. You never let anybody else take the oven. And I actually loved working there because we had complete camaraderie. And actually that's the point I'm going to get to. Solidarity sometimes is imposed by the need to get through it. And so there at that job, literally, we had a really good supervisor. He let the workers pick the employees. I should have never gotten a job. I had no skill set, except for I was a nice guy. And a bunch of the people they'd had before were experts, taught at culinary institutes and stuff, but they were hitting on the women. Like, gone, And I mean, it's production. How long does it take to learn? Within 10 days, I had the same skill set. And so we actually, as a team, had a blast. We worked our butts off and played ping pong and drank coffee in our breaks, and worked like nonstop for 10 hours. I loved working there. I left there because I wanted to work in a collective, and I got there, and like I said, I was completely like people like not, getting cooperation. And it turned out that loads of people who went to work at this collective had no interest in collectives. It's just that was a good job, which wasn't easy to find in Berkeley. It paid like, at the time, $7.50 an hour was a lot of money back in the 80s, and it gave health benefits.
Was that Arizmendi bakery?
No, not at all. No, Arizmendi's didn't exist then. It was just the cheese board existed, but they weren't so big that they were starting new ones by then.
What was your
It was the Swallow restaurant. It's now gone, Its claim to fame is that the last editor of Gourmet magazine, that woman, that's the only restaurant she ever worked in. Anyway, the one time that we had that camaraderie, and we did completely, was when there was an exhibit, like I remember the Juan Gris exhibit, when we were swamped, utterly swamped. Then everybody got along. You had no choice. If you're going to make it through the day, you had to cooperate, And the Americans are real good at that. Like if there's some disaster and stuff, people pull together, And what we have to figure out is how to create that in ourselves, because that's what they've done. They don't have to have an external problem to be in solidarity. They just have embraced it. It is the, what they are into,
Can I jump
what
in
drives them.
really quick there?
Yeah.
On the disaster front, because you just made a point that I think is true, and also the opposite is true about Americans cooperating well in disasters. Because there's also the whole disaster capitalism thing, where there are these giant military industrial complex mechanisms for taking advantage of disasters, taking advantage of fractured societies through warfare or ecological devastation or tsunami or whatever, and they come in and take over the economy and transform it into an even more extractive form by taking advantage of the disaster. And so one of the critical things I think to understand here, and like Naomi Klein wrote that book on disaster capitalism, right? But is that when there are rapid changes occurring in society and economics, those are these leverage point moments when either things are going to get really bad because opportunists are going to come in and take advantage of people and landscapes and figure out how to extract through the confusion, or it's a moment when we can choose to cooperate more profoundly in that disaster moment and come up with transformative solutions. That's the time when people are willing to engage in transformative solutions, is when all of our systems fall apart and we feel really insecure. The rest of the time, most of us are pretty complacent. If we're having our basic needs met, we're not going to make transformative choices. But when disaster hits, boom, we can change systems then. So it's like one of the lessons here, and that for me is we have to be there ready as things that are experienced as disasters happen to supply positive cooperative opportunities, right? I think that's one of the things, the big lessons in facing climate change, that's one of the things we're looking at with Co-operate WNC, is how do we be here ready with positive new forms of living and working together so that people don't get desperate and go into fight or flight mode and go into competitive violent mode, which is also a very real possibility.
Right, and the book, by the way, that he's talking to is called Shock Doctrine. It's pretty illuminating. If you haven't read it, it really, basically, it's Milton Friedman's theory and take advantage, like they did it in Katrina. They can.
Iraq.
Iraq is like totally, Chile's another one,
Yeah.
but actually, for America, they got rid of the public school system. They took advantage. They seized that moment to trash the public school system. There were like housing projects that were built during the Works Project administration were like gorgeous, incredibly well built housing projects and very well taken care of by the people who lived there. It was so nice, they took good care of it. They didn't get flooded. There was no reason to not be there. They told them they had to evacuate, and then they just condemned them because they wanted the land. And so that can happen, but it is true too, as Zev said, that a way to get solidarity is to respond. And we've, right now in America, and it's actually, I spent a long time being an anarcho-communist, and I'm not anymore, I'm still, I call myself a lapsed Catholic and a collapsed anarchist, but I'm not really concerned about economic systems. I don't think they matter that much. I think what matters is that they serve the community and are controlled by the community. I think there's plenty of times that I had a bakery and I understood that, economic incentive could really help my bakers to focus, And I also knew from working in the swallow that it's really hard in our culture to just say, oh, we're going to be a cooperative. We don't have all the background for that. So I don't really care about economic structures. But right now, if you look at the polls, right, much to the dismay of Fox News, right, because even their poll showed it, more than 50%, 51% of the millennials prefer socialism to capitalism. And indeed, of the people below 50, the majority prefers socialism to capitalism. Now, they're not hitting 50%, but there's might be 44% for socialism, 33% for capitalism. Within that, they're also totally into entrepreneurialism, which tells me that it's not really about economic systems. It's about, we just went through 2008. We now have the most broken politics we can imagine. We need something different. So it's one of those moments. We are in a disaster right now. We are headed, we have 12 years, and anybody that's a farmer knows that's true, If you went through 2013 and last year, you know that we're getting a lot more water than we had. It is time to deal with stuff. And clearly the politics are broken. It is time to take advantage of those problems and to do what we're talking about today. So we do have that.
Do you think that Mondragon, kind of its founding moment, was related to the disaster scenario of that moment that made it more open?
I think so. I think that he was a powerful enough figure that he might have pulled it off otherwise. But Franco did not like separatists. They fought against him, and they were separatists. There wasn't much going their way, But actually, Father Arizmendi knew how to pull strings. The whole system that he set up, he actually learned what laws there were in Spain and figured out how to make pretty regressive laws work for him. And he also knew how to find the people in power that he could talk to. So he went to people, bureaucrats trying to do the various things they were doing, and he went to people that he could talk to and said, I think that this law says we can do that. And he got rulings and stuff to do stuff that basically, if Franco had been paying attention, he never would have been doing. And by the time Franco outlawed teaching the Basque language, they were strong enough that they were able to, completely ignore them, set up their own schools and teach it. And that was because of the dynamism of him, but also why he got that focus, I think, totally was because they just gone through, there's an incredible, if you want to understand what happened in Spain, there's a book called The Blood of Spain. The author's last name is Fraser. It's an oral history of the Spanish Civil War. It's one of the best books I've ever read. Diane tells me I need to write to the author and tell him. I read that book 3 times, It's The Blood of Spain. It's an oral history, and the author's last name is Fraser.